whose history is included in
a book called Girls to the Front.
a book called Girls to the Front.
A book whose author we're lucky enough to have at the Poetry Project tonight. Mic check. Mic check. Everyone, please welcome the brilliant scholar, musician, publisher, and essayist, Sara Marcus.
Mic check. No, I was fooling you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Matt, for organizing. Thank you, Michelle, for reading. Thank you, Poetry Project. Thank you, Friday night at 10:30. Thank you. Thank you, literature. I'm not reading poems. I'm reading an essay. There are numbered sections, which I think works on the page, but comes off as bizarre out loud. So I'll just pause, and if you're picturing the pages, you can picture a Roman numeral, and if you're not, you can just hear the pause. In those days, in 1995, it was very rare to come out as anything, no matter how tentative, while still in high school. There were only a few of us girls in the freshman class at Yale that year, that we knew of anyway. We were a stumpy gamut of queernesses. Having dated both boys and girls and found myself unable to forswear either, I admired the circle's 3 declared lesbians for their clarity, their heroically unequivocating desires. Of these 3, Kramer was loudest and butchest, with rings of rainbow-hued aluminum clenched to the shoulder strap of her motorcycle jacket. Amanda had an air of well-adjusted quiet that I couldn't relate to, though in retrospect it seemed barely contained within an anxious membrane. And then there was Sara, with her sandy bowl cut and inch-thick glasses that darkened to gray in the sunlight, making her look half blind, half mad. They were glasses that marked their wearer as profoundly unconcerned with appearances, and Sarah's lack of regard for such matters seemed a mixture of noble and reckless. Dizzyingly smart, Sara sliced through her coursework, seemingly with none of the labor mine was suddenly demanding from me. I felt close to her, not because of our shared name. I hardly ever thought of my name as being mine, having long ago ceased to look up when I heard somebody speak it, but because she had grown up in the small college town in Ohio where my brother had gone to school, and where my best friend, a crow-like boy I supposed I was probably in love with, was now starting classes, and where I wished every day I had chosen to go instead of Yale. I had visited my brother in Ohio enough times that its landmarks and culture felt intimately familiar to me. And when I arrived at Yale for orientation and realized what a cold patrician institution I'd condemned myself to, Ohio's grassy squares and smoky coffee shops came to feel more and more like a lost inheritance, a birthright I had squandered in my misguided grasping for validation, access, prestige. I was miserable from the moment I got there. But the bands around my heart eased up when Sara and I talked about wide, empty roads that cut cornfields without curving, and the cavernous candy store on the main square with its fatty sugared donuts that gave way in her mouth like they were made of milk foam. Talking to her, I felt closer to my brother, whom I missed ferociously, even though he was only in Boston, and I felt closer to my best friend, whom I imagined careening at angles around the library in Ohio in his cut-off flannel pants and mouse-bitten black sneakers, surrounding himself with volumes of the Congressional Record. Most important, talking to Sara made me feel closer to that town and its college, to Oberlin, which was the name I'd given all through high school to the idea that once I got to college, my life would get better. I hadn't invented that thing about college making my life better. Adults had been selling it to me for years whenever they saw how ill at ease I was, a book-obsessed punk political girl with nebulously disordered desires and a solemn isolation I couldn't shake. The prediction hadn't come through yet. At Yale, instead of feeling less like a gloomy outsider, I found friends who were gloomy or outsidery or both, like Sara, and we took care of each other. That probably should have been enough for me, but I wanted to be healed, not just kept company. I still hoped that my oddness and bad moods might be an immunological response to hostile environments, symptoms that would clear up once I was in my true habitat. I tried to be at home there. I dashed myself against the rocks of well-dressed Manhattanites with mysterious cultural references, winter ski trips, publishing internships. I struck out with tight-mouthed girls from private schools whom rumor had identified as open-minded. I was ignored by them. Thanks. It hurt more than I was ignored by the boys reading Marx at the cafe. At last, I succeeded in dating a beautiful Iowan with a short breakfast at Tiffany's haircut who was writing her senior essay on Wordsworth and the Sublime. I still saw Sara and the others, ate dinner with them at least once a week, both imagining in the bleak language of striving that I could do better, and fearing that the Iowan's imminent graduation would prove me wrong. But I'm trying to talk about Sara, about how different our sadnesses proved to be, about how I did not know that then. I thought we might have the same affliction. I drew myself a team by imagining that my feelings of not belonging, of having wound up by terrible error at a school that was politically more conservative, culturally more buttoned down, and socially more status quo than anything I was prepared to deal with, were shared by the others. I took our common malaise as a sign that being a queer woman at Yale in the mid-1990s was an embittering, depressing situation to find oneself in, and that the problem, mine, ours, was an external one, the fault of a flawed, malignant substrate. This interpretation was truer for some of us than for others. With Sara, it was exactly wrong. I loved Sara, felt almost familial about her, but I didn't know that she was staying up all night to do her work. Not just a few nights at the end of the semester, but dependably, even for short response papers that wouldn't be graded. People closer to her knew that her compulsions and perfectionism sometimes kept her from functioning, even as her professors praised her extraordinary intellect and stellar writing. Her closest friends knew, too, that the anorexia that had hospitalized her for the first time when she was 12 had never gone away, that she now believed she ate only because she was weak-willed. If I had known these things then, I would have understood how much more intractable her adversaries were than mine, but mine felt unbearable. The girlfriend in Brooklyn who told me I'd never find love again if I left her. The anonymous classmate who called my voicemail in October of my sophomore year and announced in detail his plans to sexually brutalize me. The other student or students who called friends of mine that fall with similar threats. The college deans who shrugged their shoulders when we tried to get them to go after the harassers, to institute sensitivity trainings, anything. Sara and the rest of the gang from freshman year supported me immediately. Together we organized rallies and called meetings with administrators. I started eating dinner with them more often. If I arrived at the table in tears, they would know what was wrong without asking. I felt grateful to my friends, but I was still unsatisfied. The sisterhood of sadness and anger chafed as much as it comforted. I don't want to say I fled. I escaped. I went to Oberlin to try it out for a semester, and my senses started opening up. I have only vague, sparse memories from my year and a half at Yale. When I left, my world became instantly more vivid, like Dorothy opening her door onto a Technicolor Oz. By the time I got back to New Haven for a summer fellowship with a union, I knew I would finish school in Ohio. Sara was in the same fellowship program that summer. We lived together in a 6-person house a block north of the Yale campus, a wonderfully cramped commune with steep pitched floors that made our desk chairs roll around empty, and the giddy luxury of 2 living rooms downstairs, one in front and one in back. I cooked big cans of beans with corn and tomatoes and froze the leftovers in yogurt containers to eat for weeks. Sara seemed to live on boat-sized carafes of Diet Coke. In the mornings, we listened to NPR together in the kitchen over my tea, her cola, slices of buttered toast. In the evenings, we sat together by the electric fan in the window, reading or watching Woody Allen movies I'd checked out from the public library. Back in Ohio that fall, Sara's parents, the town's Baptist ministers, cooked me lunch at their house, noodle casserole and creamy green beans topped with crispy onions out of a can. I went to their church one Sunday. I felt a little disappointed to see chairs arranged in a circle instead of all facing the stained glass rosette in the grand sanctuary. I understood the idea, but I would have liked to face forward, not inward in a ring. I was glad, in any event, to have the friendship of grown-ups who would never be in a position to grade my work. I liked, too, thinking that they must be aware, through Sara, of how awful a place I'd just fled. They would not ask with incredulity bordering suspicion why on earth a person would leave Yale for Oberlin, a question that sometimes made me feel like crying from the sense that I had failed at some crucial task. Being at Oberlin was like falling in with a tribe of outcasts who were forming a whole magic world together out in the middle of nowhere. The joys were many: fresh bread in a co-op bread box, 80s dance parties, Walter Benjamin, and my feeling for the first time in years that I was not irrevocably othered. Amid all this, though, I still had long bouts of persistent loneliness, of feeling like my mind was encased in thick cotton, of being half an inch away from breaking into tears. I had long called these feelings depression until a friend in my dorm told me about having no access to language or thought for days or weeks at a time, about literally being unable to comprehend why she would ever want to leave her room again. Depression, then, was the unreachable thing I'd seen in my crow-like best friend before he dropped out of college, leaving me alone. What I saw now in the fitful letters he mailed me from his drifting life. Reading them, I began to understand that it was just simple, viscous sadness, through which I watched cars crawl down the unswerving street outside my dorm. Whole layers of that sadness had lifted off when I'd flown to the Midwest, but some filmy portion remained, and that part belonged not to Yale but to me. This disappointed me, yet I never doubted that it could be survived, that I would live through it. I was more fortunate than I'd known, but at the time I felt only relief. I got phone calls late at night after the rates had gone down, not from Sara, but from our friends who were still being harassed and beaten, their plaints disregarded. "You did the right thing," they whispered. "I should have gone too." But I never let myself be fully sure. I would visit Sara and the others in New Haven on breaks. Certain trips I saw a settled industry among them, other times something thicker and more gnarled. On every journey, I tried to mentally scotch-tape myself into the scenes I witnessed. Who would I have lived with, dated, confided in? What professors would I have studied with? I had lost my childhood knack for recruiting adults to the cause of me. Sara still excelled in her studies, conducted archival research for fun. Scholarship suited her. She seemed to wear it elegantly, not like me, always fumbling to find an armhole, my pockets inside out, my zipper jamming. But she was still pulling desperate all-nighters, writing countless drafts, battling her compulsions, and coming out behind. Yale wasn't slowly beating her down with its homophobia and upper-class conformism. If anything, its manic faith in achievement so harmonized with her inner world that she finally felt at home. I rarely saw Sara in Oberlin, but I often imagined her there, the teenage Sara, walking through the town's main square, ushering at her parents' church, toting her backpack and Diet Coke to the college classes she took in 12th grade. I felt her presence so strongly in town that I can't say for sure whether she was there for my commencement. Maybe I just imagined it. The night before the ceremony, the square was strung up with colored paper lanterns, and the ladies of the hospital auxiliary sold pie wedges and ice cream from folding tables. It had seemed for years that my time at Yale, those 3 semester-sized pomegranate seeds, might yank me back into the underworld I'd fled, but here I was, marrying bachelor number 2. Bachelor number 1 had forgotten my number the instant I had skipped town, it turned out. I believed that Sara was there that night of illuminations, that the pie ladies had known her since diapers, that we introduced our parents to each other, that she then, as in the beginning, was the one who knew both my before and my after, who understood and approved my leap, even as it was one she never would have wanted. We lost touch entirely. In fact, I forgot, more or less willfully, all the women who had been my circle of deviants in the beginning, until I found one of them again a decade later, or she found me. Our escapes had brought us similar places, art, New York, the city swimming pool, and Bedford Ave. Neither of us was all that sad anymore. Life had gotten sweeter for us as time had passed. We'd both meandered for a while after college, then come out okay. She told me that Sara had stayed in New Haven after graduating, first working for a nonprofit in town, and then re-enlisting for another tour of duty at Yale, going for a PhD in religious studies. She was an academic star again, winning fellowships left and right. Her personal life was going less smoothly. She had married a woman soon after finishing undergrad, her parents leading the ceremony in the Oberlin church. church, but the marriage hadn't lasted. Beneath that fact was something my friend didn't say, but I heard it anyway. The old sucking darkness, solemn and greedy. I admit it, I was glad Sara and I had lost touch. My life had started when I left Yale, and I wanted no obligations to that earlier anxious prologue. Every success, every sign of happiness felt so fragile still, I guarded them zealously. This meant that when news reached me last fall that Sara had killed herself, I mourned mostly alone. For days after hearing of her death, I frequented the online profiles of our friends from that first year, watching them share virtual hugs. I sent condolences around and knew I merited none. I had cut myself off. I found myself thinking of Sara as the ultimate victim of that time, thinking that in her the wounds of undergrad had kicked off a blood infection that eventually ravaged her completely. But of course this was wrong. The kind of hurt Sara had was not the kind that trading one school for another can cure. Leaving Yale had made things worse for her, I learned later. By the time she finished her dissertation and went on the academic job market, she'd been living in New Haven for a decade and a half, continuing the functional codependency she'd found with the university as a teenager. She had long settled routines and deep friendships, and as much as she fought with her OCD to let her call any piece of work finished, I imagine the familiarity of life there was a comfort for her. And then she had to give it up, taking a fellowship in Germany. She left there before her year there was finished, though, and moved back in with her parents in Ohio. There were glimmers of progress. An excellent university press signed on to publish her dissertation as a book. She took a job teaching at a liberal arts college in Virginia, but privately she worried that she would never succeed professionally. She wondered if she should leave academia altogether. She almost made it through her first semester in Virginia. Then she didn't show up to her class the Monday after Thanksgiving. They broke into her apartment to find her. What gripped her was something so unbearable that even my closest analog to it, my self-pitying teenage thoughts about how much easier dying would be than all this, was no comparison at all. People asked me, how did she, but I couldn't stand to know. Instead, the awful solo acts of others eddied around, a rally of unfathomable despair. My friend's mom in the family barn, the folk singer and his kitchen knife, that kid from Rutgers, the implacable lights of the George Washington Bridge, Peter from senior year, the punkest of us all, suspended from his kitchen ceiling. Lovers or children open the door to the shop. If there's a note, it rarely precedes the body itself, rarely softens that horror in advance. It's like the person already dead is telling you, from her mouth, from her still hand, is telling you why she did it, why she had to, how infinitely sorry she is. She is so sorry. She asks for forgiveness. She had no choices left. Sara's family had spent years trying to keep her alive. It seems they always knew their efforts might someday fall short. They were battling something from Greek myth or a zombie film, something that can be fended off for periods but never destroyed. I was so far from her by then, and even had I not been. When somebody from your past dies, you start thinking about the time in your life when you knew them. When Sara died, I was already thinking about college because I was in the process of assembling PhD applications, excavating old term papers and ordering up transcripts that conveyed unwelcome news. My grades had been worse than I remembered. My term papers seemed to have been tapped out of my brain in shards, thin and desperately wrought. I'd forgotten about my dark Oberlin moods, but these papers read like the work of somebody whose mind was seized up with sadness. It all came back then, and I remembered feeling like the fly in the Jonathan Edwards sermon, dangling over a pit of fire. When I left Yale, my fate had seemed unfixed. I could get worse, or I could get better, and I didn't know which it was going to be. I wonder if anyone could possibly look at a group of unhappy 18-year-olds and know which ones will and won't make it. Who will grope to a truce or even triumph with the help of drugs or talk, industry or spirit? Who will find peace receding again and again from her grasp? I'm not sure I can credit anything to will. I tried with all my might to win out, but Sara tried too, probably harder than any of us. What then can we call it, this difference between sadness and despair? What but luck or grace? I'm mute in the face of it. I'm alive. Sara's dead. We once were friends, and she helped me feel less alone. That's it. Thanks.
I discovered Michelle T in the purest possible way, lingering one afternoon in the small but incredible, in the fact of its very existence, graphic novel section of NYU's library, where by chance I pulled from the shelf her 2004 book, Rent Girl. I opened it randomly to the middle, read a page of the text around which Lauren McCubbin's dazzling artwork was arranged, and was immediately struck by writing that managed to be both so unaffected and so merciless at the same time. I read another page and another, did one of those backward staggers with my hand waving around because I was too engrossed to look up. Located a chair, sat, and read the rest, went to the beginning and read what I'd missed, checked it out, and did the whole thing again from start to finish. Then I went back the next week and got out everything else they had, while also Googling. Side note, what if the Google homepage is really the magically disguised clitoris or glans of the world's cleverest fairy, and each and every time anyone anywhere in the world types in search terms, we stimulate it. And the rest of the internet is simply the fairy's jouissance. What I loved, the more I read of Michelle, was what Sara Marcus describes elsewhere concerning a different writer in a different place, as how, quote, a breathless tone and a stance of wild romanticism could transform ordinary goings-on into adventure, everyday life into myth. Everything was accessible, everything was meaningful, everything was available to be discussed and assessed and incorporated into an exuberant and revolutionary worldview. In other words, Michelle's alive, and she writes down what that's like. And if you in your carelessness forget, it happens, you can go read her stuff and remind yourself. In my case, after I found that book, I went all over telling everyone I knew to read Michelle T. And they were like, we know, dummy, she's amazing. Thanks for catching up. We're glad you finally did. Please welcome Michelle.
Sweet introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I love the Poetry Project. I love Sara Marcus. I love all of you. I love so many of you, even the ones I don't know. All right, I'm going to read you quite a bummer. Ready. Speak of the night, man. Since Sun's in Scorpio, we're in Scorpio, it's time. I'm not a comedian. All right. This is called My Mother's Husband. 13:23, just did math. Okay, let's go. My mother calls me while I'm at home in San Francisco, working on my computer in my kitchen. In San Francisco, I live alone in a spacious one-bedroom. People visit and crane their heads looking for my roommates. My monthly rent is more than I've ever paid, but only $300 more than what I was paying to live with 3 other people, all in their 20s, a bartender, a drag queen, and a student. I decided to move out when I found that our fridge was filled with sickly, shriveled houseflies. They moved slowly in the cold of the fridge. I realized they must have been born there, and that baby flies are maggots. I was 39 years old and feared. That's right. I did the math. I was 39 years old and feared that if I celebrated my 40th birthday there, I would have a crisis. So I moved. My mom calls me from the lanai of her own home in Florida. She lives there with her husband. Because my mother is a graveyard shift nurse and her husband suffers from a disability that makes sleeping difficult, their bedroom goes mostly unused. They take turns sleeping on the puffy, fake leather couches in the living room. They sleep before the blaring television, always turn to Fox News, though neither are Republican. The television doesn't seem to bother them, nor does the cups of coffee they drink like water throughout the day. Their circadian rhythms are so busted from overnight work shifts and round-the-clock napping that coffee and the hysterical blathering of pundits have no effect. My mother tells me that they moved the futon from the spare room into the living room and are trying to sleep together again. They're on the floor, between the couches and before the TV. Her husband's spinal disability makes it hard. Keep laughing. Even when it gets really dark, you're like, I shouldn't laugh, just please keep laughing. Her husband's spinal disability makes it hard for him to get out of a normal bed, but a futon on the floor is manageable. They haven't slept together in a very long time and seem to be excited, though he has already rolled off the bedding and onto the floor, bruising himself. I leave my computer when my mother calls and lay down in my own bed to talk to her. My own bed is a very firm mattress sunk into an antique French headboard, carved with an argyle pattern, and also with flowers and ribbons and birds. My room is filled with light. My mother tells me her husband is probably experiencing the beginning stages of congestive heart failure. They're not sure. He doesn't have health care, and so attempts to understand what is making his feet swell up and his stomach bloat into a hard ball, what is making him short of breath, have not gone well. It's just an awful situation with the health care, my mother says. Her voice betrays 40 or so years on the North Shore of Boston, where the accents run thick. No R's to speak of, and then certain words, say half, have such a refined pronunciation that the dialect's British roots are revealed. Half. Don't let the car get below half. Don't let the car get below half. That's what my mother would say, and you're like, I don't even know where you're from right now. My mother is from New England, specifically the city of Chelsea, a place that made national news when it went into state receivership in the early 90s. The amount of people living below the poverty level is about exactly double the state average. My mother has health insurance and her husband doesn't. The cost of putting him on her plan is too much, yet he was turned away from their local free clinic because my mother's income is too high. I don't ask my mother how much money she makes, it seems rude. On occasion, my sister and I will send them checks, most recently when my mother broke her knee at work and needed groceries. Through a series of bureaucratic bamboozlement, my mother was not given any paid leave for her accident. Her time away not compensated, she returned to work too soon after the accident, on painkillers and in a wheelchair, to care for a ward full of seniors, some younger than she. She heard herself slipping in a puddle of urine. My mother's friends suggest she lie and say that she and her husband are separated. He can get a post office box and redirect his mail there. My mother can say that she allows him to stay in the house at night while she is at work, but he's forced to leave in the daytime when she returns. This could help him get better health care. I can't do all that lying, my mother says. You shouldn't have to go there. In San Francisco, where I have lived for almost 20 years, I have had health insurance 3 times. For 1 year while working at a housing clinic, facilitating the removal of lead from low-income apartments in the Tenderloin. For 1 year while working at Mills College teaching fiction. And for the past 5 months after my partner put me on the insurance she gets through her employer. The majority of my care has been through the city's free clinic system. I could walk into any clinic and wait all day, but eventually be seen. With a little paper card, my medicine was $5. The staff worked to find ways to cover your cost. Though I was a lesbian, for years my annual gynecological checkups were covered through a federal family planning fund. They were like, do you use birth control? And I was like, I'm a lesbian. They're like, you use birth control. Okay. I was like, whatever. Just don't give me a bill. Just whatever. The free clinic closest to my mother and her husband is open 1 day a week on a first-come, first-served basis. My mother's husband was just rejected for Social Security benefits for the 3rd time in a row. She said that having more than a high school education worked against him, as well as how much money he'd made the year before he got sick. Both my mother and her husband attended the School of Practical Nursing offered by the Soldiers' Home in Chelsea, a vet's hospital. The program is free and you work at the home after graduation. My mother graduated when I was 9 years old, then promptly divorced my father. I often think of the program as a way of giving the city's many uneducated women in bad marriages the tools and the income to get out. While working at the home, she met her husband. He was an orderly with homemade tattoos on his fingers and an earring. She was scared of him. They married a year after her divorce, and within another year or 2, he attended the Soldiers' Home and got his LPN. My mother has continued to work in geriatric nursing, even though she has dreamed of being a pediatric nurse. The extra year or 2 of schooling needed to get her RN, with its attendant pay scale and increased opportunities, has been disregarded. My mother says she doesn't want to be like those people. What people? I cried. People who make more money? People who live more comfortably? They think they're better than everyone, my mother said. And plus, I'm too old to go back to school. My mother tried and failed to get a part-time job at the big lots near her home. The management feared she would be bored with such work. She dreams of working at a bookshop or as a Walmart greeter. Before he became sick, my mother's husband was promoted to manager at the assisted living facility he worked at. He had to report to work in a tie, which disturbed him. He was asked to overcharge the patients from wealthier families to make up for the economic drag of the poor residents. He was also expected to discipline the staff, his fellow nurses and aides. He quit. My family is not cut out for positions of authority. Having spent too much of their lives resenting those in charge, the transition into such a role is psychologically impossible. For years, I thought that my own raging against the upper classes, my resistance to bettering my standing, was a punk Marxist stance born of my own moral spirit. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that I realized I was parroting everything I'd heard in my home my whole life. After leaving the management position, my mother's husband found work as a home care nurse. He would drive to different homebound patients, administering medicines and routine care. Apparently he was a favorite. Both he and my mother are proud of what good nurses they are. They talk to their charges like normal people, like equals. They treat them with compassion and respect. They possess a certain snobbery about having received their training in New England, in Boston, my mother will stress, not in Florida or any of the other podunk regions where her co-workers were certified. My mother did internships at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Beth Israel. A New England healthcare education is world class. My mother's husband began to chafe against his job. What he loved about his work was the freedom, no one breathing down his neck alone. Okay, wait, what did I tell you? I just wrote this, you guys. I read it once, and then I wrote a whole bunch more this morning that I just like read it, wrote it in this like bar and then showed my computer, so surprise! Okay, so it's like my stepfather's the job was driving around helping out people. My mother's husband began to chafe against his job. What he loved about his work was the freedom, no one breathing down his neck, alone in his truck listening to Aerosmith on his way to the next patient, who he'd goof and pal down with while administering his care. But the management wasn't reimbursing his mileage and gas is expensive, plus the wear and tear on his truck. Though sometimes they wouldn't have work for him, they forbid him to sign up with other agencies. Then he became sick and that was it for employment. A combination of shames keeps my mother from sharing her and her husband's problems. She doesn't want to be a burden on her children. Parents are supposed to give their children money, support, help, not the reverse. She doesn't want me to worry. I've had a strained relationship with her husband, and perhaps she doesn't want to give me more reason to wish they weren't together. Her husband, too, can be secretive. Sometimes I think they're both shady. It can seem like they're hiding things, not telling the full story. Maybe they're not. At the start of the pop of the mortgage bubble, when me and my sister sent them checks and hoped they could hang on to their home, I was confused. My mother put her husband on the phone to thank me for the money. He sounded ashamed. I spoke despite the fist of guilt and pity in my stomach. Why are you working? Why are you helping Ma? It would be a little while till I got the whole story. By then, their house was gone. The last time my mother's husband left Florida was Christmas 2007, when they came to San Francisco for the holiday. My sister came as well, and her husband and his mother and her boyfriend. Me and my sister put my mother and her husband up at a hotel in Union Square, in the middle of the hustle bustle, where the cable cars clang all day. We hadn't expected her husband to be so sickly. The 3 blocks down Powell to grab a hamburger in the mall food court killed him. He seemed to be in tremendous pain as he walked, the kind of pain that evicts you from your body. He seemed to be both intensely focused on moving forward and also totally checked out, ignoring his body's command to stop. He was present and not present. What's wrong with him? My sister asked in the hotel lobby. He's going to need a wheelchair. Oh, he'll shoot himself before he ends up in a wheelchair, my mother said, fearful and defensive, or winds up in a home, God forbid, he'll kill himself. Suicide as a sane response to a more draggy ending is something my family has always championed. A bottle of Seconal and a 6-pack, my grandmother would say about her time, should her time come, preceded by cancer or dementia. And it did, by lung cancer at the age of 54, and there were no barbiturates or alcohol, just a long, painful, drawn-out death at Mass General, where she laid in a bed convulsing, bald from chemotherapy, her body shrunk and whittled into something resembling a Chinatown chicken. My mother shared her depressive death wishes with me until I ordered her to stop. Still she lives. My grandfather requested not a burial, but to be thrown in a hefty bag and tossed into the bay. But a burial he got, replete with handsome young Navy officers, sounding taps in his honor. No one dies well, but it is true that poor die worse, with less care, more terrible care, no care at all, and then burial costs the families can't afford. It took my mother a year to come up with the money for my grandfather's memorial, the stone, the cremation. A burial was not an option. It makes sense they try to control the eventuality with gallows humor and a DIY attitude. In San Francisco, my mother took her husband to a traveler's doctor downtown. He saw them after hours, late in the night, and prescribed painkillers that could only be filled at the 24-hour pharmacy in the Castro. She took a cab there and back to fill it. I learned of this the next morning when it was all done and her husband was floating on a cloud of painkillers. Actually, he wasn't floating, not in the way painkillers lift you when you don't actually need them. He was just normal. It had absorbed his body's struggle, and he could be among us on Christmas Day, smiling, excited to see San Francisco, hanging off the side of the cable car that took us into Nob Hill, to the French bistro we'd be eating our holiday dinner at. He had beef Wellington for the first time and found it pleasing, as did I. We both enjoyed the lobster risotto. We'd agreed on a secret Santa plan to stop everyone from spending money on everyone, but my mother cheated and gave me a light blue sweater from Old Navy. My sister's mother-in-law picked up the bill. On the cable car back downtown, she shoved a pocketful of bills into the operator's gloved fist and expressed sympathy for his having to work on Christmas. He dinged the bell at her. In the hotel lobby, I said, "Ma, you should have called me. I could have gone to the Castro for you. I could have come to the doctor's." But my mother didn't want to worry me. She was too busy worrying about me. my recent breakup, my new AA sponsee. My mother was happy I wasn't drinking anymore, but she didn't like me hanging out with so many alcoholics. I was like, look, I got a new AA sponsee. She's like, really? Is that all right? Her husband is an alcoholic as well, though he hasn't taken a drink since the early 90s. He went to AA for a moment to get his footing, but all the talk about God and the members' dependence on the meetings bugged him. On the telephone, my mother tells me that their car broke down again. She laughs when she tells me, though it isn't funny. My mother has a peculiar tic wherein she laughs broadly while delivering bad news. It used to drive me crazy. Why are you laughing, I'd ask. Do you think it's funny that your car broke down, / your husband fell while mowing the lawn, / was run over somehow by his own truck, / lost his truck, / was declined for Social Security? The hurt in her response made me feel like a monster. Of course she was laughing because it wasn't funny. I'd grown up in this family. If I didn't understand their ways by now, age 41, I was hopeless. I asked her what happened to the car, and she tells me it was the oil pump. The good news is the oil pump is new, less than a year old, and therefore under warranty. The bad news is she has to fix whatever broke the oil pump. The badder news is that the car has been in the shop. The badder news is that the car has been in the shop going on 4 days. She's having to take a cab to and from work, a city or so away. Do you trust your mechanic, I ask her, because her car is always breaking down. My sister has a theory about their car always breaking down. The theory is that my mother's husband is a secret drug addict. No longer with an income of his own, he has rigged up a situation with their car mechanic, who would have to be a drug dealer in order for this theory to operate. The theory is nothing is ever really wrong with the car. It's just a cover for my mother's husband to get money to the drug dealer for his pills. Before my mother's husband stopped working, when he was a home healthcare nurse always on the road, my sister had a theory that he was actually seeing prostitutes. My sister's theories sound far-fetched, but similarly outrageous theories in the past have proven to be true. We're going to a new mechanic, my mother tells me. The last one, he's a nice guy, but he makes too many mistakes. My mother pauses, feeling a bit guilty for judging the mechanic. But then, you know, the car is 20 years old. It took all the money I'd saved to visit your sister, so she's going to have to feed me while I'm there. All we want to do is feed our mother when she visits, and buy her things, as if we could somehow save her with tuna sandwiches and hamburgers and tchotchkes from the Disney store. But she is our mother, and all she wants to do is take care of us, paying for our lunches and dinners, and buying me cast iron pans and glittered silicone spatulas from the fancy kitchen shop by the water. It is hard to accept things from my mother, but to not, I fear, robs her of her dignity, her desire to be a mom taking care of her kids, from a feeling that all that is right with us, that our family demonstrates the natural order of things. Parents take care of kids. Kids don't take care of the parents. Not until they're very old anyway, and even then, you inherit something, don't you? My mother and her husband make ridiculous decisions with money. The way that she came into any at all was from throwing her back out at work in the 90s. Her settlement was enough to buy a house where they lived in Massachusetts. Soon after, my sister and I confronted my stepfather about his creepy behavior when we were younger. The family fell apart for a while, which my mother dealt with by maxing out her credit cards on trips to Disney World. Her husband became a certified diver and took trips off the Keys, swimming with whale sharks. Eventually, they decided to live inside their vacation and moved to Florida. She sold her home to her husband's brother at a deep discount, not bothering to try to make any money on the sale, let alone get what they paid for it. Her brother-in-law struggled with a lazy wife who wouldn't work and 2 teenage boys. Plus, the houses in Florida were cheaper. About a year after they moved to Florida, the brother-in-law sold the house at a profit and joined them in Florida. The house he bought was bigger and had a cage pool. When a hurricane ripped apart their town, my mother's house was spared, though she was traumatized by the experience. The windows on her floor of the managed care facility had imploded, spraying glass across her patients. The tornado in the parking lot created an otherworldly atmosphere that popped her ears and sucked the elderly toward the hole in the wall. She found her staff, a group of CNAs from Trinidad, holed up in a nurse's lounge, holding hands and praying loudly, and ordered them back into the ward. When she returned home, her house was so obscured by fallen trees she thought it was gone. She cried with relief to see it wasn't, and she cried for the next month, erratically bursting into tears at the Home Depot, buying a flat of water, or talking to me on the phone from her home, a dark and oily place, powered on generators, the windows boarded, fans replacing air conditioning, weakly trying to push the Florida swamp out of their home. When a man came around offering to haul downed trees out of their yard, she paid him up front for 3 days' work. He was a stranger, but he had a little girl with him, and he seemed like he needed money, and she felt bad. She gave the little girl lemonade. The man worked for half a day and never returned. When my sister got married, my mother's anxiety about the cost of the wedding consumed her. She decided to sell the lot that came with her house. It didn't matter that the wedding was paid for or that her plane ticket and housing would be taken care of. She wanted to help. She wanted to buy a dress and pay for lunch the day after the wedding. The possibility of a sale rose and fell, rose and fell. Do you know about Joseph in the ground? My mother asked me. European Catholic nuns once buried statues of St. Joseph in the ground outside property they wanted for their convents. Now people bury the statues on their own property when they hope to sell their homes. She purchased a Joseph in the ground kit from a Catholic supply center and dug him into the wild lot beside her home. She signed off on a fast sale of the lot for less than she could have gotten had she waited, but the wedding was coming. My sister tried to block my mother from spending any of it on the wedding. She wanted her to put it in the bank. Do you have any savings at all, my sister demanded? How are you going to take care of yourself when you retire? We're going to have to take care of you. My mother bristled. Retire? I'll work till I die, she snapped. You're not going to take care of me. I told my sister she needed to let our mother pay for the lunch. It's important to her, I said. She needs the dignity to make her own decisions with her money. My sister's therapist said this was true, so my mother paid for the lunch. My mother's husband's medicine runs her $400 a month. It is harder and harder for him to get his prescription filled, as their region of Florida is plagued by pill mills, illegitimate pain clinics staffed by doctors who will prescribe morphine and OxyContin to addicts. Morphine and OxyContin are his medications. The pain clinics have become tiny police states, with all patients presumed guilty, addicted, by the cops who patrol and raid the places. Squad cars idle in the parking lot. My mother's not allowed to wait for her husband in the parking lot. Waiting in the car is prohibited. Because he's not insured, her husband can get his prescription at the pain clinic, but he can't get it filled there, as they don't take cash. He goes to the pharmacy at Walmart, but they are clean out of narcotics. He finds a private pharmacist that is scared to take on a pain pill client. My mother's husband talks him into it. I think about writing about what my mother's husband is going through in order to get his medicine, and ask if I can talk to his pharmacist about it. His response is terrified. Oh, no, he says on the phone. He won't talk to you, and he'd stop filling my prescriptions. I don't understand, I say. Nothing illegal is happening. Why is he so scared? Why is it so hard for you to get your meds? Why do some people have really, really hard lives while other people's lives are easy? Why don't I have a degenerative spine disease? My mother learned from another friend in Chelsea that 3 other men of her husband's generation have strange spinal disorders. They all grew up in the same neighborhood, a series of streets that dead-ended into a large waste dump. What are you going to do, my mother says, and it's not a question. It's just what's going on. She's talking about her husband's body, the swollen feet and belly, his trouble catching a breath. It is what it is. But we don't know what it is. Could it be the meds? I wonder if they're not bothering his liver, my mother wonders. Your liver, your heart, your lungs, they all coincide. My mother and her husband are the least healthy healthcare professionals on earth. They have done nothing to supplement the education they received in the 80s. They chain smoke and have resigned themselves to the deaths they'll be rewarded with. My mother reacts with fury against the anti-smoking legislation popping up around the country. When she arrives in California, she's not allowed to smoke outside the airport. In San Francisco, she cannot smoke in a park. Before you know it, they won't let you smoke in your own house, she rails. Mom, you're paranoid, I said. People just don't want to breathe in cigarettes, it's gross. I know, she says, slightly ashamed, it's terrible. Her addiction butting up against her desire to make everyone happy, or not make anybody mad. Her husband has a high white blood cell count. What does that mean, I asked. How did you find that out? When we went to the free clinics and they told me I made too much money, she scoffs, they handed him an inhaler and sent him home. How is he doing today? He's down in the dumps. Her husband has been depressed about his condition, about his inability to contribute to their life. To compensate, he'll mow the lawn or take on a chore beyond his ability, resulting in falls and increased pain. He has burst into tears, afraid that she will leave him. For years, my sister and I have wanted her to leave him. Now, if she leaves him, he'll die. If his feet swell up again bad, we'll go to the emergency room, she tells me. He's not in dire straits, like I need to call 911 or anything. Dire straits is something my mother will say a lot. They're waiting for him to reach this level to bring him in. But I wonder if they are able to accurately recognize what dire straits looks like. To me, they have been in dire straits for quite some time. What does the bottom look like to them? His feet came down some once he put them up on pillows, she explains. They were so red and shiny. It is hard for my mother to explain the situation in a straightforward manner. I think she is in a state of perpetual overwhelm. Why are there fluids in his feet, I asked her. It's a congestive heart failure thing, she says. The heart's not pumping and the fluids pool in the feet. I noticed Thursday or Friday he took a shower and came to sit down. I said, you don't look good. He was huffing and puffing. My mother got one of her nurse tools, an oximeter. It's a little gizmo you put on your finger and it tells you how much oxygen is in your blood. I said, put it on and go walk into the kitchen. He shuffled into the kitchen, where their untrained Maltese, Kira, pees on newspapers on the floor. He shuffled back. 91, she said, not good. We put people on oxygen at 92, but then it went back up again. He's not in dire straits. Dire straits. Only my mother talks like my mother. Who says dire straits? They're banned. There are all sorts of old regional phrases that my mother carries on. Not for nothing. As in, not for nothing, but I should have looked into the situation for nurses before I moved to Florida. There's no union. It's a right to work state, meaning you have the right to work and they have the right to fire you. Or, light dawns on Marblehead. Marblehead is a fancy town down by the sea in Massachusetts, but it's also your own thick-headed noggin, slow to understand. He's going to talk to his doctor, my mother continues. He wants to get off some of his medications. Wait, I thought he doesn't have a doctor. His pain management doctor at the pain clinic. She does labs, but she's not his primary care. He doesn't have that. I could have him go to Mapitan, that's her doctor, but he won't do shit. He'll say, put your feet up and watch your salt. You don't know that, I said. Is it because my life is so comparatively easy that I'm quick to access hope? Because my life has turned out well, do I presume everyone else's will too? Why don't you just try Mapitan? Because he doesn't have insurance. No one wants to see you. They literally tell you they don't take uninsured patients. I begin a rant about the Hippocratic Oath. Don't all doctors take a pledge to not let people die? I am ruined from a life in San Francisco, where people like to do good things. I do not understand how the real world works. We'll see, my mother said. Like I said, he's okay right now. I'm a realist, Michelle. I'm just a realist. He's got a disease process in his back. That's like not a real phrase. He's a heavy smoker, though he's kind of smoking way down, and people get sick. I am relieved that my mother is so detached because I fear her being in emotional pain over her husband dying before her eyes, and I am chilled at her coldness. When they found a cancer in my grandmother's nose, my mother was also a realist. He's an old man, she repeated. She didn't think surgery was a good idea, but they took care of the cancer and he lived another decade. I don't think I'm exaggerating, she says. I just know what I see, and his belly's gotten huge. I would never think that my mother exaggerated. My mother and our whole family downplays everything. They do not exaggerate. They are a meek people. For years, my mother would play the lottery, elaborating humbly on how she would spend the money. I'd keep some, she'd say, but I'd give it to you kids. I'd give it to Papa and Willie, Papa's girlfriend. I'd give it to Darlene and the kids. I'd give some to Kali. It was a prayer of sorts. My mother is truly Catholic. She believes that selfless altruism is rewarded with the granting of more selfish desires. The pagan roots of her Irish Catholicism exist within her without her knowledge. Her prayers often resemble spells, Joseph in the ground, playing our birth dates on the lotto. In her hardened acceptance of death, she's a Scorpio. In her work, she is Hecate, ushering the dying out of this life. Her husband also believes in the value of aiming low. Wanting to transition out of nursing into his passion, diving, he dreamed of washing the windows for a dive shop. Would you want to lead dives, I asked, or work on the boat? No, I don't care. I'd be happy just washing the windows. These goals filled me with a heartbreaking rage. I saw inside them the history of my own low standards and lost potential. It made me want to kill them both. That was before he got sick, when I spent the visit researching universities that had programs in marine anthropology, registering him for information. He wanted to study shipwrecks. Why would I think someone satisfied with washing windows at a dive shop would have the wherewithal to enroll in university? I hadn't even had such wherewithal, had not attended university. This was once their fault, but at this point, it's my own. My mother is explaining her husband's body to me. It's just that your heart doesn't pump right, so the fluids in your body, instead of it moving, it stagnates. You got valves in your legs that pump the blood back into your heart. What is the fluid? Blood, plasma, lymph, blood. Your blood just isn't blood. What does he want to do about his meds? I think he wants to get off them all and start all over again and see how he does without them. They don't know enough about syringomyelia. That is her husband's disease. When he was diagnosed, my mother called and asked me to look it up on the internet, something she didn't have. I printed out pages of information and sent it off to Florida in an envelope. Duke, UCLA, and Mass General are just starting to do tests. There's a new medicine available called Neuroten. It's for neuropathy pain, for nerves. It's not a narcotic. The whole thing is no health insurance, my mother says. You can't even go in and get it straightened out. We'll see what you can do. It seems to be a chronic thing. It's not like, oh my God, I gotta call 911, you can't breathe. But the shortness of breath is new. Her husband doesn't want to go to the hospital anyway. Oh yeah, and there's another bill for you, she says, and I can't contribute. But I don't care about that. You think I care if I get a $2,000 bill from the ER? Seriously, I'm 62. What are you going to do about it? I'll give you $10 a month as long as you give them something. What are they going to do? There's no debtor's prison, my mother's fond of saying, and good thing. She went bankrupt traveling to Disney, moving to Florida, installing a hot tub on the lanai of the house they eventually lost. I'm reading a lot about that generation, she says, referring to her husband, a decade or so younger than her. The 60s and 70s, people did a lot of shit and it took a toll on them, their livers and hearts, and it's showing up now. I wonder if he could have hepatitis C like a lot of people who once shot drugs. They were wild childs, my mother says. It shifts from vaguely cavalier, yet agitated, to somber and guilty. Part of me feels bad for talking to you about it. I haven't even talked to you in a week and now I just dumped this all on you. The doorbell rings and Kira the Maltese begins to bark wildly. Hold on, it's my pizza, she says. I wait on the phone while she pays the delivery guy. My mother doesn't have many people to talk to. Maybe some casual friends at work, a couple old flames from childhood she's reconnected with on Facebook with sickly wives. They commiserate. Her parents are dead, and her only brother is a mentally ill drug addict, so gone that at this point it's impossible to tell when he is high and when he is having an episode. She comes back on the line. I think you need to talk about it, I say to her, and she says, I guess I do. We have confusing boundaries, my mother and I. I have forbidden her from sharing so much of her pain with me because I didn't want to hear how she wanted to die. When I wouldn't speak to her husband, I didn't want to hear about how hard it was for her. Maybe it's hard for me not to have a family, to have a peeping Tom stepfather, I lashed out. Now she shares this new trauma in the stop-and-go mode, bursting with it all, then backtracking sheepishly. But I think it's okay for her to tell me. My mother's pizza is getting cold. She has to go and eat it. I love you, I tell her, and she counters with, I love you more. That's what she always says. Kisses and hugs, she sings songs and makes a bunch of squishy kissing noises into the phone and hangs up. Thanks.